My name is Jerm. This is Jerm Warfare, the battle of ideas. Charles, Mike has, to quote Radiohead, left us high and dry.
Well, come on, that's a bit harsh. I think he has gallantly stepped in to co-host the news program today. I think that's what you actually meant, isn't it?
Yes, but I was looking for a way to give a thumbs up to Radiohead. I was listening to them this weekend.
Right, okay. Well, you're going to have to take the lead on that. I have to admit, I'm not much of an expert where Radiohead is or was concerned.
They come from your country, man.
Is it? Yeah, but then again, how much time did you ever spend chatting to Johnny Clegg?
Very little time. But I did know that he
probably less than me.
That he came from South Africa. Radiohead, by the way, are probably one of the greatest bands ever. And in actual fact, let me just before we chat about anything serious, the UK, I think, has brought out some of the best music in history.
Yeah, but hold on. Again, I mean, we're going to have to qualify a lot of this stuff because when you say history, I mean, how far back is your history going?
Last 50 years. I mean, of recorded music.
Yeah. Yes. I would agree with that. But then again, if you're, nowadays, I take massive pleasure in listening to, and again, I can't go into details, but just the types of music that come from sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Totally different stuff, but really, really engaging. And with a sort of jollity to it that I think is missing or has been missing from quite large chunks of British music for a long time. There's a lot of quite miserable stuff out there as well.
I just want to quickly,
which I have to say, I don't really go
add
for.
A disclaimer because I know someone's going to say, yes, but Tom York is involved in all this horrible stuff. Yes. I'm not a fan of his politics and all that kind of stuff. I'm just simply talking about the music. But the segue here, Charles, is I wanted to chat to you about creativity. And I know you actually wanted to chat about it too, because I've been talking about creativity a lot in the last week or so, just as it happens, with friends. And the link is AI and how much creativity can come from that. And of course, where we are today versus, let's say, 20 years ago, even 50 years, 100 years ago. It's a strange conversation because it makes you question again, what creativity is.
Yeah, I mean, I think my start point is just to think about why it is that it's not really talked about so much. I think those that look at the world perhaps with an element of despair and think that we're not perhaps getting it quite right. I feel that creativity, for want of a better term, sort of overarching umbrella, I think it's not really thought about very much. But actually, if you do look at the types of art forms that were being produced, exactly like you say, further back, 100 years or more ago, I think there's been a very, very pronounced shift, and that is not a coincidence. And I think there's a load that one can learn from it. And also, I think there's a lot that one can learn from the Emperor's New Clothes element to it, and how on earth we've got to this point, because in a lot of instances, and a very easy one would be to point to, say, the Turner Prize, which has been one of the really significant movers in the sort of modern or conceptual art world over the last 2 or 3 decades. And at the very first meetings where stuff was being submitted that, quite frankly, did not conform in any way to what had previously been regarded as art. And what I mean by that is to put something into a competition or to exhibit something as art that, frankly, anyone else could have done. There wasn't any demonstration of skill, as it were. And that's where this idea of something being, it's conceptual, it's the thought that's gone into it. It's actually, no, I don't think anyone else could have created it. I mean, I absolutely do fall out with that. And the standout example was Tracy Emin's bed, which was just a bed covered in junk. And I'm sorry for anyone who thinks there's more to it than that. There really isn't. That is what it was. And it was just the only reason it floated as an idea, it was because it was to do with the sort of the self-involvement. It was because of what it described about her life. Well, I don't know. Is that really that interesting? And I think, again, that was very reflective of the way the culture has gone. And the same thing's been reflected in music. Song lyrics have moved from using the word you to using the word I. So there are these terrific shifts. And you just talked about AI, artificial intelligence, and the way that people are just absolutely pointed into the most insular, I suppose, in a way, narcissistic version of themselves. And I think creativity and art in all its forms has to be looked at in this, but often it isn't. It's just totally overlooked as though it's a sort of sideshow. But I don't think it is a sideshow at all. I think it's absolutely part and parcel of it.
Yes, and just for the sake of clarity, when we're talking about creativity, we also have to define it. So I would argue that creativity is being able to produce an idea or something that is probably new, novel, and meaningful. It has value. And if we look at AI, in many ways, you have to ask, does that fit the definition?
Well, I don't think so at all. I mean, how can it? Because all it's able to do is make an amalgam of things that it's looked at elsewhere. Okay, you could say that, in a sense, that's what the human brain is doing all the time. But I think I have to reject that, especially when you go back to classical music, about which I know not nearly enough, unfortunately. But the way in which music was constructed is not, well, I mean, certainly, obviously, these things become cumulative. But at the point, go back several hundred years, the themes that were being developed, the types of music that were coming out, well, it was all original. It was all absolutely original. And of course, that went alongside the development of musical instruments and the types of spaces that you'd be able to use to create the best effects for music and all that kind of thing. And that has now, that's been reduced down because of the way in which electronics have taken over everything. And this isn't, I mean, it's not a criticism, it's an observation, but that's been reduced down to such a sort of simplistic method for listening to, appreciating, enjoying, or creating, let's say, creating music. But I think, what I would go back to, the only thing I would add in terms of creativity is the difficulty or the skill or the fact that you, as the creator, are doing something that somebody else can't do because you're putting your particular stamp on it. And that's why I use the example of Tracy Emin's bed. Anyone could have done that because it was just the process of arranging a whole load of what get called found objects in art. Where's the skill? And that's the bit that's missing. And that's why AI has come in, because it tricks the user into thinking that there's skill because something's created that might look a bit different, or it might look at first glance perhaps impressive. So there's there's skill. There's not. There really isn't. And I think that just says a lot about us and what we've become willing to accept.
Listen to this. Creativity is what happens in the gap between stimulus and response. It's what emerges when a human mind is left alone long enough to wonder, collide ideas, feel uncomfortable, make something unexpected. It requires boredom, risk, failure, and freedom. It is fundamentally an act of resistance against the predictable. Now, that little bit there about the gap between stimulus and response, for me, is quite important when talking about AI. Because if you're going to create a song on AI or create an artwork, which you're going to claim as art with AI, what is happening between the stimulus and the response?
Well, absolutely. As far as the human's concerned, nothing really, I don't think. But I mean, the obvious thing to ask you about are the creation of your cartoons. You've done, you've you produced the fine image for first issue of the Column magazine, and the next one, yes, which of course is under wraps for now. But let's say, take that as an example. How do you do that? What are the processes that you go through well before you start to actually draw or paint anything?
Well, I mean, it comes down to thinking first. And I love the idea of being bored, because boredom forces you into creativity, because you want to get out of that state. And as a result, I would get bored with doing the same thing over and over and over, obviously, right? So then I want to try something different or try something new. And when I think about, the initial idea, the general direction that I want to go, there's an intention, and that's also important. There's an intention. There is a destination where I want to go. I'm not just randomly drawing stuff on the page or whatever. And the process along the way is very fun and creative, and I can get immersed in it and get lost in it for that few hours. And if I get too lost in it, then I will lose the destination. I won't get to where I need to go. So there is a little bit of analysis that happens along the way, but it's putting together all the various elements of the physical drawing and enjoying it and knowing where I'm going with it, and remembering that there's a message also, by the way, coming through. It's not just Jackson Pollock throwing stuff on a canvas. So there are multiple levels.
Okay, and then the other thing, for anyone who hasn't seen your artwork, your style is very distinctive. I would say it's immediately obvious when seeing a cartoon of yours that it is by you. How did you develop that? I mean, do you remember even coming up with, as I say, what looks like a style? And how did you arrive at that?
I love that question, because that is sort of like a band that's trying to create its own style of music and recreating it as it goes along. So I get bored again with my own stuff. So if I look, I mean, I've drawn thousands of cartoons over the years, and if I go back, it looks very different to what it does now. And I think it's just a matter of pushing my own limits. One of the things that I think that you're alluding to when you talk about my style is my line work. My line work is very messy, very, very loose and messy. That has taken years to get to, because you need quite a lot of confidence to draw like a 5-year-old. That's the way I look at it. Because one of the things that we do as we get older is we want to become as analytical and professional as possible, but we lose that kindergarten spirit. And that for me is something that I never want to lose. I always want to feel like I'm having that sort of childhood fun. Quentin Blake is a great example. Drew famously for all of Roald Dahl's books. Look at his style. It's very, very loose, and it's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful to look at. And for me, that's what I enjoy. I want to be able to look at it afterwards and go, that looks really nice. I don't want it to look like it was mathematically and academically put together, But there are many cartoonists who draw very, very precisely, and that's also fine. But I'm just saying that it takes a lot of confidence to be able to put lines down and go, they're not neat, but I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Well, I absolutely agree. The result is terrific, and of course, referring to Quentin Blake, I think people would be instantly familiar with what that means. But that is fascinating. You see, that tells anyone listening a lot about you. Again, I think in the way that just chucking a whole load of things over a bed doesn't quite do, and it is a totally different thing. And also, if I were to sit down to try to replicate your style, I wouldn't be able to do it. And I think that's another critical detail of this. And the reason, just to go back a bit, because I think this does bring it to the sort of more generic in terms of what we see all the time. The reason I suggested that we talk about this morning was because I spent a long time on the motorway over the weekend, and cars now are on the roads in the United Kingdom, Western Europe. They are becoming increasingly homogenous in design. I mean, have been for a long time. But what's so interesting about that is that the moment you see a car that is more than 40 or 50 years old, it instantly catches your eye. It can't fail to. And it doesn't really matter what sort it was. There are, you'll occasionally see an old Ford that wasn't sort of designed to be a thing of beauty, but nonetheless now it almost does seem to be a thing of beauty because it's not just yet another sort of anodyne, it doesn't look the same as everything else. And even Renault now have tried to reproduce a car of theirs that was a real hit in the 1980s, the Renault 5, and they've put out a new version of it. And I can see that it will catch people's eyes. That seems to be mostly to do with the colours that they've produced it in, but just not in the same way. It is not the same. It doesn't have that same look or feel about it. And I think we've just lost it. And car design, the refrain is, oh, well, it's to do with aerodynamics, efficiency, and safety. That's why cars have had to become like that. Now, I don't buy that at all. But I think it just tells us a lot about where we've gone as a society, that now I can't think of a single thing that is designed in such a way as to primarily look beautiful. Buildings absolutely being case in point. And not only that, with buildings, you get in effect, the double whammy. They don't look good, but also they don't actually last long. They're made of materials that deteriorate very quickly. So some sort of fancy structure put up today in 5-10 years will look terrible. And there's not really anything you can do about that. Whereas, a lot of older buildings you can clean up, you can make them look better again. So it is a big part. And after all, these are things that we're surrounded by all the time. And I just don't think, it is not good for the soul to be looking at these sorts of things in comparison with how they were.
Yes, and I think many will argue that a lot of this is by design, and I think I might agree with some. I think there's a convergence of there's a convergence of design and emergence going on here, because if you make everything look the same, you remove the element of uniqueness and, of course, creativity, and everything becomes kind of like zombie-like, and that's a fairly transhumanist way of looking at things. Everybody must become the same. In actual fact, it feeds into culture wars on multiple levels, Charles, because egalitarianism, for example, is one such example. It's making everybody the same. We must all look and think and be the same.
Absolutely. Well, it's one of the enduring features of the Soviet Union. If you go to, I think the thing that always sticks in my mind is a children's playgrounds. If you walk through any town in the former Soviet Union, and you'll see exactly the same coloured fence around the edge of a children's playground. All the sort of slides and swings and everything else are absolutely identical. It doesn't matter where you are. I mean, that covers a span of thousands and thousands of miles. And yet it was all homogenized in the same way that so many things were. And I wasn't there, of course, but the way in which the Soviet Union did operate, it's absolutely not coincidence that everything within that geographical area was totally standardized and looked the same. And that seems to be absolutely an indicator. And this is really why I think it is such an important subject, because we're now we're occupying a space where everything is beginning to look exactly the same. And of course, the other, people, the idea that fashion or clothing is in some way distinct. I mean, it's just not. The people are by and large just stuffed into exactly the same bits of clothing, and there's no sort of individual flair or character or anything like that anymore now. Or at least people are immediately obvious when they do look different.
I saw that homogeneous style also when I was in China. From the old days, there's a lot of the same kind of architecture, and I find that very depressing. One of the things, for what it's worth, even though Europe is in all kinds of cultural decline, there is unbelievable architectural beauty.
Well, there absolutely is, and I think that's why the changes we're talking about are so jarring. Because I perfectly agree with you. You know, what I have seen of Chinese cities, I mean, very, very uninspiring. Endless rows of buildings that look absolutely identical, and that is not. I don't see that is a good environment within which to generate, to foster, encourage creativity. I just don't see how it can be, or indeed, you know. We talked about this a lot, the sort of the mystery of how it is that Chinese society does appear to behave as it does. And, you know, everybody's got their own theories about exactly this and the idea of how the state does exert the control that it appears to have. So the debate is, I'm sure, to be had on that. But what is perfectly clear is that Chinese society has changed a lot over time. And is that a part of it? Is that a factor of it? You know, if you create the conditions around people, you make an environment that is not one born of imagination, difference, and creativity. Do you somehow create within the minds of those people the same sort of subdued levels of imagination, creativity, and all the rest of it? I think that there must be an element of that. This is why, as I say, this is why it jars, because Western Europe is absolutely full of incredible architectural flair and character, but only to a point. And that has just stopped. And even buildings now that are described as or intended to be avant-garde or daring or even beautiful, I think by comparison they pale into insignificance. They are not the same at all. And in fact, when you look up close and when you're familiar with these things, they tend to use, exactly like AI, in fact, they tend to use an amalgam of the same thing. So you can pick particular features, and they're normally structural. So you'll look at the way in which some sort of tubular frame has been used somewhere, and you see exactly the same thing in multiple places. And the reason for that is because, exactly like car design, there's the priorities are changed. And so rather than creating a genuinely beautiful building, in fact, what you're really saying is, well, it's going to be cheaper, or it's going to be easier, or we can create this particular effect if we use this material, and therefore we will do a cut and paste job. And I think that's what's happened. Whereas the buildings of course, you're always going to be constrained by what you can do structurally. But if you look at, I mean, cathedrals is such an obvious example. They are incredibly daring, bold, but also individual. Yes, they conform to roughly the same ideas, but actually there is no mistaking them. I think you'd find it very difficult to confuse, say, two splendid cathedrals, and there's a huge range. But I don't think that's the case with modern buildings at all now. It's
a difficult conversation to have because we are speaking about an abstract concept here. I mean, creativity, yes. It's not something that's hard and fast. But I think generally, Charles, if we just take a step back and if we consider that if people are creatively passive, a lot of that is not necessarily their own doing. They simply aren't aware that they are being manipulated through the algorithm. They're being managed through all their devices. And so they become intellectually dependent, I suppose, on everything else that's directing them and managing them. And when that occurs, even willingly or unwillingly, they become easier to control and sell, products to. And I think a part of that also is self-censorship. I mean, self-censorship, in my view, is instrumental in suppressing creativity, because you are becoming fearful of what those around you might think or say with your own idea expression. Does that make sense?
I think it does, yeah, absolutely it does. And I think the point about the passive nature of any of this is another really important one. And that is in effect what has happened. People are not the primary creator in so many instances now. You are in some way obliged to use some sort of an intermediary. So the obvious example is people losing the ability to write properly with a pen or pencil and going straight to a keyboard instead. And a keyboard, of course, is creating...
Sorry, but can you write in cursive still?
The joke is that, what is the joke about doctors' prescriptions? Yeah, I mean, I handwrite everything. I think we have talked about this before, actually, but no, my use of a keyboard is only where I actually have to send the thing or commit it electronically. Otherwise, I write everything down. So yeah, I mean, I write absolutely in small, barely legible, but I would say neat at least. There is a distinctive style to my handwriting, and that to me is a very, very important thing to be able to do. And I would not want to note what I do note down on a keyboard. I don't like that idea. And in fact, even in terms of fonts, I don't know. It's funny, isn't it, that the style that an old-fashioned sort of clackety-clack typewriter creates, I find that pleasing on a page, especially when there's still sort of the indentation and there is an actual physical piece of paper. But that's, for me, that is absolutely not replicated. If you create a document on a computer, looking at it, or even a printed version of it, it's just not the same. It's not. I can't really pinpoint exactly what it is, but there's just something that is not quite right about it.
I like what you're saying there. Somebody asked me a few weeks ago, do I handwrite all the text, for example, in my cartoons, or do I use a font? And I handwrite everything, and I have since I started drawing. And the reason for that is quite simply the text is part of the cartoon. It's also part of the artwork. I don't mind, I suppose, using a computer font. It depends on what the intention is. A lot of cartoonists do that, and a lot of newspaper cartoons, even going back 100 years, would use a type font, a caption that ran underneath it.
Yeah.
But I've always preferred handwriting.
I think it looks better. I mean, there is. I think we still. This is what we'll never get away from, I would hope, is the ability to detect whether or not something is human created, human generated. And I'd say no. I mean, I know it constantly improves. I don't want to fall into the trap of suggesting that AI is anything other than a human created program that is sophisticated. But I think people are basically pretty good at discerning whether or not something's been generated by AI. It's too bland and too polished, and I don't think that it looks like it. You read something that's been written by AI, you listen to something, you look at something. I think we're still not going to be deceived by it.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And I really hope that remains the case. And I think it's pretty alarming if that ceases to be the case, because it does pose quite big questions about the senses that we retain. And I think this is, again, another part of it. We are, okay, I know we've talked about this before, but the whole sort of, well, are humans animals, or are human, should we be regarded as
different? I think we're different.
Never mind that. Yeah, okay, but the point is that we used to have the ability to detect with certain senses things that we absolutely can't do now. There are some, like the idea that somebody's watching you, or somebody is behind you, or things that you can't really rationally explain. Well, why is it that you just know that's the case? But you watch a dog or a wild animal, how it reacts to its environment, and try and think, well, gosh, how on earth? How did it do that? How did it know that? And what we're able to do as humans in the 21st century is, I think, a shadow of what we were able to do previously. And this is why I do find it very interesting, because I'm also of the belief that that's the case physically as well. I think we are fairly pathetic specimens physically compared with what we were certainly 200 or 300 years ago. and going far further back, because I do not see how we could possibly have endured as a species without being significantly more able in so many respects. But then that is an interesting point, because then we go back to what we might describe as early art, cave art, for example, or even the more naive versions of sort of early Renaissance art. And the story, the history of art will tell you, oh yeah, that's because they hadn't really worked out perspective by that point. Now, is that credible?
No.
Is it really credible? I mean, I see children now getting to an age. I mean, it depends on the child, but some children will work out perspective in terms of drawing it by the age of 7 or 8. That has not been a learned skill. It's just spending that time, whether through boredom or whatever else, spending the time looking at something and thinking, okay, that bit looks bigger at this end than it does at that end. And I can draw that by making lines that will converge at a point in the distance. So the idea that this was not clear to those creating art in caves, or indeed on canvas or on walls hundreds or thousands of years ago, I don't buy. They were doing something, they were trying to do something which we don't understand to this day. But to me, it's completely fascinating, because I think it throws up in the air this whole nature of our understanding between creativity, art, and society. And the other thing that, again, I find totally fascinating, compelling, is the argument put forward by one of the many arguments put forward by Camille Paglia about art effectively telling you where you are insofar as a civilization is concerned. And her contention is that when art, particularly the representation of the human form, becomes all sort of androgynous and there's no longer the if you think back to some of the statues created by, let's say, Michelangelo, strong muscular men, and then you move to a point where the human form is represented as either being vastly sort of bloated and obese, and obviously a sort of distortion, or very, very waif-like, with no real possibility of telling even perhaps what sex the subject is. To her, that is an indicator defining the end of the demise of a civilization. And I think that is totally fascinating. And that's why I think this debate, this topic, is so interesting and so serious, because that is in effect what I'm seeing with the design of so much stuff now. We are at that point.
I mean, that's exactly correct. I can't argue that at all, because creativity is a characteristic of being human. It's fundamental to our happiness and to everything that we are, at a very sort of existential level. I don't think animals, from what I can tell, can be creative. They act basically instinctively based on survival. You're not going to find a polar bear painting, so. No,
okay, fair enough. Yeah, maybe not painting, but I will take you to task on that somewhat, because you definitely will find polar bears playing, and that is effectively what we're doing. So they will create a situation in which they want to take pleasure, and I think that's the point of coincidence. So yes, without the wherewithal to paint, yeah, I would agree. Then they're not doing that. But to suggest they're not creating anything, I think, is not the case.
No, there's a difference, though. There are. Okay, so there. I'm trying to think how to express this. They're
with difficulty.
Being playful seems to be hardwired into most living things. There's a difference. There's a difference in being playful, because being playful also acts as a type of evolutionary. And I'm not buying into the argument of evolution. I'm just saying there is a biological reason for the playfulness, because it helps them create awareness for their surroundings. It adds to strength. If you look at two male elephants, it helps create a hierarchy. So what I'm trying to say is there's an instinctive reason for that playfulness. And I don't know whether or not it's creativity. If that, I'm struggling to express what I'm.
Yeah. Okay. No. I think I know what you mean. Yes. Okay. Yeah. No. Fair enough. I think what you're saying is that there is in effect an end to every one of their apparent.
It serves a purpose.
Means of, yes, exactly. Yes. But then isn't that exactly what it's doing with human beings? We are in effect expanding our minds.
No. Okay, hang on. Sorry, I'm jumping in again. Sorry, Charles. But creativity. Remember at the beginning, I suggested that it's also based on something new.
Yes.
Being playful is not creating It's not presenting something new.
I think it can be. It entirely depends. If you're watching animals that do not occupy the same piece of territory all the time, they move. They will use different bits of ground to do different things wherever it is they go, and they will find. Similarly, if it involves finding a different way to eat. I mean, I appreciate that's not necessarily creativity, but the example. Sorry, I'm shifting slightly, but let's say the example in the 1960s, I think, the blue tit in England. I think it started down in the south of England. Milk bottles that were delivered with their silver foil tops left outside people's doors for quite a period of time. This had just never happened. And then I think it started in Southampton. Somebody observed a blue tit flying down, landing on the edge of the bottle and pecking its way through the silver foil in order to get to the cream on the top of the bottle. And within 2 weeks, that was being seen in the north of England, that behavioural characteristic. Okay, that's not playing, so I admit I'm slightly twisting the thing. But that is creative. That is absolutely an expression of creativity. There were other things that they could have eaten, but they found a way in which to sort of exploit their environment for gain. Which I agree ties in with your idea that that playing is effectively developing a skill that's going to be useful to them. But this is I hope we're talking about the same thing, because this is why
I think we are.
We go back to the idea that and I'm not accusing necessarily Chinese people of not being creative, but if you do surround people by monotone architecture, let's say, I think you're creating an environment that is less permissive for, or less stimulating for creativity. So I think that's sort of the theme, really.
The irony, though, is that the Soviet Union, you mentioned earlier, certainly encouraged creativity, despite the fact that they were perpetuating non-creative environments.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, but just not necessarily in an artistic sense. So I suppose creativity, what we haven't really dealt with is the idea that creativity encompasses a whole lot more than just artistic creation. And exactly like you say, I mean, the technological advancements that were made by the Soviet Union or have been made by the Chinese or, now under the spotlight, the Iranians are phenomenal. Now, is that at the expense of the sort of the arts, or is that alongside great leaps of creation in the arts? I don't know.
Well, I mean,
people will take
it's
a
funny
view
though,
on that.
because a lot of what we think is creative has also been driven by corporate interests as well as government interests. Jackson Pollock, I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation. I mean, he was a CIA asset. Despite the fact that he's so famous and he created art that is worth millions and millions and millions of dollars, which I think is absurd, because he literally ran and threw paint on a canvas. But the reason for that was because it was the US. The CIA was wanting to do something to show the Soviet Union during the Cold War that the US was different. It had nothing really to do with art. It had everything to do with geopolitics, which also is pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, but this is the other element to it, is that art, throughout the ages, art has been used very, very effectively as a as an information tool or a critical part in the information war. You think of how we talked about cathedrals and whatnot. I mean,
well, Woodstock. Let's talk about music. Woodstock.
Okay, yeah, all right, yeah, but really, I think I just mean the sort of the following the money and the storytelling and the creation of art, not just for art's sake, but the creation of it because it tells a particular story. It sends a message, and then we get into the financial element of it, and rather than the artist deciding that they're going to create a particular thing, the commissioning of a work of art or of a particular building in order that a message is sent. That is, again, that's been a very, very important part of art really forever, and the part that it's played in so many sort of cultural changes during the history of, well, really all countries. You think again to talk about the Soviet Union or Maoist China, whatever it is. I think everybody would be able to bring into their mind the sort of the propagandized artwork of that period. Again, it's a really, really critical element, isn't it?
Actually, some of the most famous art of the 20th century is sort of communist propaganda. I mean, we all know the famous the Stalinist artwork, for example.
Yeah, it's absolutely, it is very, very distinctive and historically, I think, really, really important. I suppose now, looking at where we are now, we know what's the contemporary equivalent. I can't really think of anything off the top of my head that is distinct. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, but seriously, it's a serious point. This is where I go back to the flipping cars on the motorway. They are so dull. What is it saying about where we are, where we're going as a society?
But it's not just that, though. It's yes, look, you're right. But it's more than that. If you turn on Cartoon Network, which is supposedly for kids, it all looks the same. If you turn on MTV,
I take your word for it.
If you turn on MTV, it all sounds the same. You go right across the board. You fly into cities now. You fly into major cities, and they all look the same from the air.
They do. This is very true. Yeah. So what's going to come? Is there going to be a reaction against this? I mean, we've seen I forget now what it's called. I did a piece on the UK Column News not that long ago about the creation of a human-generated book sort of logo. Now I can't quite bring it to mind, but that's being done with music. So now I think that music that's being produced for CD or record, you can look at the cover of it
CD.
And it will have a
Charles.
Is that not a thing? Right. Okay.
It's 2026. I think CDs ended like in 2010.
Is that right? Okay, I did not know that. Well, I've only ever listened to records, so I wouldn't know. But yeah, the records are great. But anyway, okay. Well, a record, it will tell you whether or not it's been generated, it's been produced by a human. Which the thing is, I don't know quite how strict that is. And we think about the incredible liberties taken with food labeling. If you're going to say it's human generated, does that mean that AI hasn't been used at any point? Because this is the other element is, well, where's the line? If you consider that AI is in effect something that could be used as a factory worker in the way that you're only expecting it to do just the one thing, and it's not going to have a better idea. It is simply going to perform X task. It's not a creator. It is simply fulfilling a function. But is that, does one consider that is cheating, or have we now got to the stage where, well, it's accepted? It is just it's easier to just use AI for that, and it doesn't diminish the overall product or anything else.
It's about intention, though.
How far does one go?
Isn't it? It's about intention.
Yeah.
I'll give you another interesting example. Since we spoke about cartoons earlier, I don't know if you know this actually, but you remember the old Bugs Bunny cartoons from the 1970s when they had Mel Blanc doing all the voices, for example, I mean, I don't know if you know that one of those cartoons, which averaged around 7 to 10 minutes took about 9 months to draw with a team of like 100 people, right? Everything was hand done, everything. And I mean, we remember them with great fondness. And then something happened in the 90s. Pixar, I didn't like what I was seeing. This introduction of sort of CGI animation. And it has its place, I suppose, today. But I don't know of many animations now that are hand-drawn. It seems to almost be a lost art, and I really hope that there will be a return to that.
I would hope so. I think it is what, even if they don't know it, I think this is the thing, that people are being railroaded into a position where the thought process is not even necessarily occurring. I mean, if we go back to the motorway, I don't think many people will be consciously thinking, gosh, I'm being deprived of a sensory experience here because I'm just looking at hundreds and hundreds of cars that all look exactly the same. And I think it's only when you see a vintage motor passing the other way, or you overtake it, usually unlikely it's going to be the other way around, that something sort of goes off in your brain and you think, wow, it's just a different thing. It's a different time. It just looks fantastic. Are people going to react against it? I mean, I really hope they are. And I think it's one of these talking points that is non-denominational. I think people can absolutely unite in the face of the constant march of, let's say, AI. It really doesn't matter what you think about climate change or gender or any of the incredibly sort of thorny topics that usually don't go well in conversation if somebody's of the belief that they are supposed to think differently from you. Whereas AI, whether it be in relation to it taking work that could or should be done by human beings, or just creating a decision-making process, apparently creating a decision-making process that frankly is not the preserve of a machine, should absolutely be done by a human being. That I extend that to creativity. I think that certainly I'm yet to have a conversation with anyone who thinks that artificial intelligence is universally a good thing and that we should absolutely be pursuing it without question. I think everybody does have that sense of reservation, even if they don't quite know how to articulate that yet. And sadly, I think that for those in education now, we've already talked about handwriting and use of computers, and probably for a lot of people only being able to create art through a computer, which I think is a terrible tragedy. But I think it's only going to have to go further down that track before people react against it. Sadly, I think the problem with these things is there's such fanfare around them, and the messaging at the outset, certainly it has been within the United Kingdom, we've all been given the impression from the government and sort of mass media that this is absolutely a good thing and it should be celebrated and it should be used by children. I think it's totally and utterly inappropriate, but I can see why people would follow that train of thought in the first instance, because they are giving to trusting those voices. And I think it'll be within 5 years or so that people see the consequences and become demoralized and then react against it. I'm hoping that will happen more quickly and that people will start to react and start to change. But that's an interesting one though on the Bugs Bunny thing, because actually I have to say the person that sprang to mind for me was Raymond Briggs. I don't know if you're familiar with the Snowman, which was created in I think he wrote the book in 81 or 82, and then it was turned into an absolutely lovely cartoon, all hand drawn, every frame hand drawn, and then they created another story, a sort of like a sequel, quite a lot of years later. And his observation, exactly like you were saying with Bugs Bunny, was that they had gone from really authentic, hand-drawn, traditional creation of what was effectively a cartoon to something that really wasn't quite like that. But actually his observation was also the number of people that it involved. When Raymond Briggs had created the original back in, as I say, I think it was the very early 80s, that was done with a very small team, very small number of people who were just industrious and capable. And that evolved into an enormous team of people, apparently to produce the same result and making use of computers. And his point, which I think is which is my start point for this whole debate, is people are just not as able as they once were, and that what we get thrown at us is not, really doesn't constitute art or genuine creativity, because it's just, there's just not a sufficient degree of skill.
Yeah, I was alluding to that earlier when I was talking about boredom. I mean, the attention economy, where you are constantly kept wired, stops you from being bored. And creativity requires space, right? Creativity doesn't require only a stimulus. You need space in order to be creative. And if you don't have space, you kill creativity. And I think the education system, you also mentioned that. I think schooling, public schooling particularly, is a wonderful way to destroy creativity. I mean, it's all built on memorization, like remembering stuff, compliance, and, correct answers.
Yeah, it is. Totally. I couldn't agree more. In fact, the other element, which I think is not really given that much regard, and I have to caveat that, well, not caveat, or I'll go on and qualify it, but one other area in which this is very obviously changed is the conduct of military operations, let's say. And whilst I'm not advocating for, more slaughter and more waging of war, if you read accounts of some of the more weird and wonderful things that were done during the Second World War in particular, then it is so different from the way in which people are not just, well, I suppose, yes, taught, but the way in which soldiers are trained and the sorts of things that they come up with now. A very good example would be the Crete affair, run by Patrick Leigh Fermor and Billy Moss, capturing a German general. And, the use of mental agility as well as sort of physical resilience to achieve a totally disproportionate asymmetric effect. I mean, the Second World War was absolutely littered with that. And part of that was because people were pulled from all sorts of different disciplines and asked to do this, that, and the other. Now, again, just to reiterate the point, I'm not at all saying that we need to spend more time fighting wars, but it's just another interesting observation. Whereas now, and I can say this is absolutely personal experience, you go into a military environment, a training environment where you're supposed to be learning how to plan, and the whole point of the plan is to effectively outwit and overcome the enemy, and yet 99% of the results of the people put through that process, put on that course, are just going to be the same. They're just going to go for the same thing, and that makes them predictable. And I think this is the thing. We are becoming very, very predictable, and that is a bad thing, because if you are predictable, then to operate a system, for a state to operate a system that captures people who are predictable and therefore are going to be compliant is much easier. And I think this is what we need to recapture, is this idea that creativity and unpredictability are massive strengths and do actually open up areas of sort of, liberty, freedom, and all the rest of it that I think we are just losing control of.
Listen to this. MIT found that frequent ChatGPT users showed significantly reduced brain activity, indicating lower cognitive engagement. In other words, when we outsource thinking to machines, we stop practicing the very cognitive processes that creativity depends on. So we're training ourselves not to struggle, and struggling is where creativity lives.
Yeah, well, I could not agree with that more. For anyone listening, okay, just tell me this. How many telephone numbers can you remember off the top of your head? How often nowadays, when you're driving more than 50 miles, especially somewhere new, do you look at a map and commit the route to memory and not make a wrong turn? Anything else that involves memory in particular. I mean, I was thinking back in the early days of being able to pay, or rather not being able to, having to pay for stuff with a bank card over the telephone. I absolutely knew my bank card, that whole, 16-digit number. I absolutely knew that off by heart, always. Same thing with telephone numbers. Every single telephone number, that was, for a friend or a work thing, whatever. I knew that off the top of my head. And okay, some of those I do retain now, and some I will have picked up. But generally, the way that this has gone for almost everybody is that we have absolutely switched our brains off. And I think another very good frame of reference, if you doubt me on this, find a child who is sort of, I don't know, young enough to have not engaged with technology, and read a story with them, and then do a comprehension at the end of it, and test them on, what the name of such and such character was, where the bear ended up in the woods, and I can more or less guarantee that their recall will be absolutely 100%, because they don't have, first of all, they don't have a load of other nonsense clogging up their mind, full stop, but also they will not have relied even one bit on anything else to remember or to comprehend something. They're doing everything with their brains. And I think that's a very good frame of reference to give you an idea of, I don't want to sort of depress people, but because absolutely all this can be regained. But just as an illustration of how much we've all forgotten because we've had X, Y, and Z device supposedly do it for us, supposedly help. Well, how does that help? Honestly, it is really not like the brain runs out of room. I think this is a massive fallacy that there's only so much you can remember. That is total, to my mind, that is not true. And as somebody, as an example, Alex Thompson of UK Column, obviously sort of step back to concentrate on Bible translation at the moment, but talking to Alex is just incredible. I mean, not just does he speak multiple languages, but his depth and breadth of knowledge on so many subjects going back over so many years is absolutely phenomenal. And that doesn't mean that I sit there and look at Alex and think, gosh, yeah, there's not going to be anything else going to go into that brain. It's full. That's just not true. So I think, again, this realization, or this belief that we are so much more capable of doing more and more and more and more. And we need to remember that and realize it, and also realize what the benefits of pushing and going further actually are.
It's the capacity or ability, Charles, to imagine that things can be different. And it's that imagination that is almost being lost in so many ways due to everything we've spoken about. And I think a lot of that is on purpose and it's by design, and it's to keep us distracted, and it's to keep us not bored. And that's something we have to be aware of.
Gosh, we do. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I wonder if should we? Well, I'm thinking of sort of content here. I mean, obviously we've got Jake Fern's 1,000 Words podcast, which is amazing because we watch him sort of develop a picture as he goes. Is that something that we could ever do with you?
Yes.
Would you ever be able to film and talk about what you're doing at the same time as doing? I know that can be difficult because obviously as you talk, you are in effect distracting yourself from what it is you're creating. But I think it'd be fascinating, given what we've been talking about now, to watch you at work and to see what you're doing and how you get there. I think it'd be fascinating if you thought you were able to do it in such a way as to not compromise the result.
What a wonderful idea. I think let's chat about it offline.
All right, we'll do that.
Okay, Charles, I see the time is catching up to us. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I really, really enjoy turning these cogs a little bit because, as you said a few times now, creativity is so important and it doesn't get talked about enough.
It doesn't. It really doesn't. And I think this is, insofar as how the effects are felt, when the sort of the shutter came down in 2020, or when in 2016 we had the vote to leave the European Union, whatever it is, any of these apparently seismic changes, I have always thought, well, no problem, because I know that the creative spirit of, in my case, of the Brits, the British, will take over. People will absolutely work this one out. They will come up with all sorts of innovative and fantastic, weird, quirky ways to deal with it. And I'm afraid to say that's not really what I'm seeing now. So more creativity, more time being bored, more time spent really, really thinking and developing around the problem. Because as I say, I think the results will be absolutely well worth it.
All right, Charles, I'll catch up with you next week and hopefully with Mike.
With Mike, yeah, exactly, yeah. Super. All right, Jerm, see you then.
Cheers.